Brooklyn, 1858. A woman named Mary sits on the edge of a straw mattress in a rented room, and in her arms, her infant son has stopped crying, which is worse than the crying. He is 4 months old. He has been fed nothing but milk, the good country milk the peddlers swore came fresh from green pastures, and that milk is what is killing him. Across this city, in this single decade, thousands of children like him are dying from the same thin, blue-white liquid, sold on the same honest-sounding promise, and the men getting rich from it will churn the leftovers into butter and press the rest into cheese and sell that too. You have probably eaten some version of that cheese. Not that exact poison, but a descendant of the industry it built. You have almost certainly eaten cheese today, or yesterday, without thinking about it once. It sits in your refrigerator like the most innocent thing in the world. It is not innocent. It never was. The story of cheese does not begin in a Brooklyn tenement. It begins thousands of years earlier, in a place with no cities, no money, and no word for the thing these people were about to invent. It begins with a problem so deadly that solving it would rewrite the human body itself. Here is the reversal almost nobody knows. For the vast majority of human history, milk was, for most adults, something close to a poison. Not a metaphor, a biological fact. The gene that lets a grown human digest lactose, the sugar in milk, is a relatively recent mutation. Go back far enough, and drinking a large bowl of fresh animal milk did not nourish an adult. It doubled them over. Cramps, sickness, sometimes worse. Milk was baby food, and the body was supposed to switch that ability off after weaning. Nature designed us to grow out of milk. Which raises an impossible question. If milk made grown people sick, how on earth did entire civilizations end up living on herds of milk-producing animals? How did dairy become the foundation of Europe, of Central Asia, of the great herding empires? The answer is cheese. And the people who figured it out were doing something so clever that we did not fully understand it until we had microscopes and genetics to explain what they had solved by instinct. Somewhere between 8 and 10,000 years ago, herders in the Near East and the grasslands beyond made a discovery by accident. Fresh milk, left in a warm container, separates. It splits into thick white curds and thin watery whey. And that split changes everything. Because most of the lactose, the part that makes adults sick, drains away with the whey. What is left, the curd, is far gentler on the stomach. Age it, dry it, salt it, and you have transformed a dangerous, perishable liquid into a stable, portable, edible thing that will not sicken you and will not spoil for weeks or months. They did not know about lactose. They did not know about bacteria or enzymes. They had no word for any of it. But they were doing it anyway. They looked at milk that would rot in a day and turned it into a food that could survive a winter. And in doing so, they made it possible to keep herds not just for meat, killed once, but for a renewable harvest that flowed every single morning. We can even see the fingerprints of the exact moment. In what is now Poland, archaeologists dug up shards of clay pottery riddled with small holes, roughly 7,000 years old. For a long time, nobody knew what they were. Then, chemists tested the residue trapped in the clay and found milk fats. They were cheese strainers, sieves. The oldest evidence we have of humans deliberately separating curds from whey pressed into the dirt of Neolithic Europe. A handful of holes poked in wet clay, and it marks the moment our species learned to outsmart its own digestion. And the trick spread with the herders. Tighten the timeline forward, and you find cheese preserved in the strangest places. In the deserts of western China, in a place called the Taklamakan, archaeologists uncovered mummies buried over 3,000 years ago in the dry sand, and scattered on their chests and necks were small, yellowish clumps. Tested in a lab, those clumps turned out to be cheese. A kefir-style cheese, made with a bacterial culture, placed on the dead like jewelry, like something precious enough to take into the next world. Think about that for a second. 3,000 years ago, on the other side of the planet, people loved this food so much they buried their dead wearing it. So how did we get the rennet? How did anyone learn to reliably curdle milk on purpose rather than waiting for it to sour? Legend, and it is only legend, tells of nomads who carried milk in pouches made from the stomachs of young animals, and the natural enzymes lining those stomachs, the ones a calf uses to digest its mother's milk, curdled the liquid as it sloshed across the desert on the back of a horse. A rider stops, opens the pouch expecting a drink, and finds soft white curds and clear whey instead. Whether or not it happened exactly that way, the science is real. The enzyme in a calf's stomach is the same rennet that sets cheese today. An accident of anatomy, a scrap of stomach lining, and from it grew an entire pillar of human civilization. That is the collision at the heart of this whole story. Something tiny, curdled, almost disgusting, deciding the fate of empires. Because empires did eat it. Rome ran on cheese. Roman soldiers, marching to conquer the known world, carried hard rations of it because it was dense with the calories a legion needs. The scholar Pliny the Elder wrote seriously about which regions made the best cheeses, ranking them like a critic. Rome imported cheese from Gaul and the Alps and prized certain smoked varieties above others. When the legions built the empire, cheese was in their packs. A soldier's fortune was measured in many things, but the food that kept him alive on a 100-mile march was often a lump of pressed, salted curd. Then Rome fell, and here is where the story takes its strangest turn, because the thing that saved cheese, refined it, and turned it into the hundreds of varieties we know today was not a kingdom or an army. It was the church. And also, at the very same time, the church nearly banned it. In medieval Europe, the great monasteries became laboratories of cheese. Monks had time, discipline, cool stone cellars, and centuries to experiment. They kept meticulous records. They aged cheeses in caves and washed the rinds and tracked what worked. And many of the famous names on a cheese board today can be traced back to some patient-robed brother in a monastery kitchen, refining a recipe across generations. They had the one thing cheese needs more than anything else, which is time. But the same religion that perfected cheese also declared war on it. The medieval Christian calendar was stuffed with fasting days. Lent, most of all, forbade rich foods, and dairy, butter, and cheese and milk was on the forbidden list for great stretches of the year. To the church, cheese was a food of indulgence, of the flesh, something to be denied. For a huge portion of the calendar, eating it was technically a sin. And this is where it gets almost funny, in the way that only very old, very human problems can be funny. People did not want to give up their butter and cheese. Northern Europeans in particular, who cooked with dairy the way Southern Europeans cooked with oil, found the ban intolerable. So the church, ever practical, found a workaround. You could pay. For the right sum, you could purchase a dispensation, an official permission to eat butter during the fast. And enough people paid, over enough years, that in the French city of Rouen, the money collected from dairy dispensations helped fund the construction of a soaring tower on the cathedral itself. To this day, it is called the Butter Tower, a monument of carved stone, reaching toward heaven, paid for by people who simply refused to stop eating dairy during Lent. Sit with that image for a moment. There is a piece of one of France's great cathedrals that exists because medieval Europeans loved cheese and butter too much to obey God for 6 weeks a year. Doctors were no kinder than priests. For centuries, physicians warned that cheese sat heavy on the body, that it bred bad humors, that the poor might survive on it, but that no person of refinement should trust it. Cheese was peasant food, coarse, smelly, faintly shameful at a fine table. There is an old rhyme, quoted in cookbooks for generations, that captures the suspicion perfectly, that cheese digests all things but itself. It was eaten by everyone and respected by almost no one. The most common food in Europe was also one of the most looked down upon, which makes what happens next so satisfying, because it takes exactly the kind of stubborn, slightly unhinged person to drag a humble food into glory. And few people in this entire story were more gloriously unhinged than an American preacher named John Leland. The year is 1801. Thomas Jefferson has just become President of the United States, and in the hill town of Cheshire, Massachusetts, Elder John Leland, a fiery Baptist preacher and passionate supporter of Jefferson, decides that his town must send the new president a gift. Not a letter, not a speech, a cheese. But not just any cheese, the biggest cheese anyone had ever made. Leland rallied the farmers of Cheshire, and they pooled the milk of, by some accounts, nearly 1,000 cows, all on a single day, and pressed the curd in a specially built cider press because no cheese mold on Earth was large enough. The result was a single wheel of cheese weighing more than 1,200 pounds, over half a ton. Then they had to get it to Washington. In the dead of winter, they loaded it onto a sledge, then a boat, then a wagon, hauling this monstrous cheese hundreds of miles across a young country. And Leland preached the whole way, turning the journey into a traveling sermon. When it finally arrived at the White House, that enormous wheel, this mammoth cheese as the newspapers called it, was presented to a delighted Jefferson, who reportedly served it to guests for years. It was stamped with a motto in honor of rebellion against tyranny. Think about what that actually is. A political statement, a religious crusade, and a publicity stunt, all rolled into a single object made entirely of curdled milk and hauled across a continent by a preacher who would not be told no. That is the eccentric heart this food deserved. Somebody so obsessed they turned a dairy product into a monument. And across the ocean, in the caves of southern France, cheese was earning a devotion just as fierce, if far older. The blue cheese called Roquefort has a founding legend as romantic as any love story. A young shepherd, so the tale goes, is eating his lunch of bread and ewe's milk cheese in a cool limestone cave when he spots a beautiful girl in the distance. He drops everything and runs after her, abandoning his meal in the cave. Weeks later, he returns and finds his cheese transformed, veined through with blue-green mold, and instead of throwing it away, he tastes it, and it is extraordinary. Whether the shepherd was real hardly matters. What is real is that the people of that region discovered that a specific mold, growing naturally in those specific caves, turned plain sheep's cheese into something the world would fight over. They protected it so fiercely that Roquefort became one of the first cheeses in the world granted legal protection, a rule that says it can only be called Roquefort if it is aged in those exact caves. That mold, that cave, that cheese, it belongs to them. It is their story, their inheritance, carved into the law itself. No one else on Earth is allowed to claim it. For most of human history, then, cheese is a story of ingenuity and obsession and faintly ridiculous devotion. But we have been circling something darker this whole time. Because when cheese, and the dairy industry around it, collided with the modern city, with millions of people packed together and desperate for cheap food and no one watching, the result was not charming. It was a slaughter. This decision, made by men who chose profit over the lives of children, was quiet and clerical, and it wore the mask of ordinary business. It was not quiet in its consequences. Return to that Brooklyn room and the city it sat in. As American cities exploded in the 19th century, they had a problem. Millions of people needed milk, and there was no way to keep real, fresh country milk from spoiling on the long journey into the city. So an industry grew up to supply milk locally, inside the cities themselves, and it was monstrous. Distilleries, which made whiskey, produced enormous quantities of hot, spent grain mash as waste. Someone realized you could feed that boiling slop to cows, crammed into filthy stables right beside the distillery. The cows, fed on nothing but this alcoholic waste, penned in disease-ridden sheds, often literally rotting, sometimes too sick to stand, still produced milk. A thin, bluish, sickly milk. But thin blue milk does not sell. So the dairymen doctored it. They added water to stretch it, then added chalk and plaster to whiten it back up, then added molasses or burnt sugar to give it the creamy color of real milk, then sometimes added starch or flour to thicken it. This is what they sold to mothers as pure country milk, complete with pictures of green meadows on the cans, and they sold it by the millions of gallons. It was called Swill milk, and it fed the poorest families of New York and Brooklyn and other cities, the families who could not afford anything else, the families with the most babies and the least protection. Historians have connected this poison supply to the deaths of thousands upon thousands of infants. In some years, in some neighborhoods, the child death rates were staggering, and swill milk was pouring into the middle of it. And the surplus, the milk not sold as milk, was made into butter and cheese and sent out to be eaten by even more people who never knew where it came from. This is the part that should make you angry. Not the sickness of the cows, though that is horror enough. The doctoring, the chalk and the burnt sugar and the meadow painted on the can. Every one of those additions was a choice, made by a person who knew the milk was poison and decided to make it look like it was not. The disease was ugly. The disguise was evil. And they got away with it for years because the men behind the Swill dairies were not anonymous. They were connected, wealthy, and protected. When a crusading illustrated newspaper, Frank Leslie's, launched a campaign in the late 1850s to expose the swill milk trade, sending artists to draw the dying cows in their filth, the industry fought back hard. Officials who were supposed to investigate produced reports that conveniently cleared the dairies. Politicians with ties to the trade blocked reform. One inquiry, stacked with men friendly to the industry, actually declared the Swill dairies acceptable. The evidence was public. The dead children were public. And still the machine protected itself, because there was too much money in it and too little value placed on the lives of the poor. The blue milk was made by sick cows. The cover-up was made by healthy men in good suits who could read the death statistics and chose their profits anyway. It took decades, more exposés, more dead children, and eventually the slow arrival of real food safety laws, inspection, pasteurization, honest labeling, to strangle the swill trade. The same fight played out over cheese directly in what became known as the filled cheese scandal, where manufacturers secretly replaced the valuable butter fat in cheese with cheap lard, then sold the fraud as the real thing, until the government finally passed a law in the 1890s just to force them to label it. Over and over, the same pattern. A beloved, ancient, honest food corrupted the moment it became industrial, the moment a curd could be counterfeited for money. Nature gave us cheese, greed gave us the poison version, and the fight to tell them apart cost more lives than anyone wants to count. Which brings us, finally, to now. To the cheese in your refrigerator, safe and labeled and inspected. You would think, after all that cheese would settle into being just food. It did not. If anything, it got stranger. Because cheese today is not just food. In some places, it is literally money. In northern Italy, there is a bank. A real bank, with a real vault, and inside that vault, stacked floor to ceiling on wooden shelves in climate-controlled rooms, are not gold bars, they are wheels of Parmigiano-Reggiano. Hundreds of thousands of them. The bank accepts cheese as loan collateral. A cheesemaker hands over young wheels. The bank stores them and ages them for months, sometimes years, and lends the maker money against their value, because a properly aged wheel of Parmigiano is worth hundreds of dollars and only becomes more valuable as it ages in the vault. There are vaults in that region holding cheese worth well over $100 million, guarded, insured, cataloged like bullion. A food that medieval doctors sneered at as coarse peasant fare is now, quite literally, kept in a bank. And where there is treasure, there are thieves. Cheese is one of the most stolen foods on the planet. Not shoplifted wedges, organized theft on an industrial scale. In Italy, criminal rings have hijacked entire truckloads of Parmigiano. Hundreds of wheels at a time, worth small fortunes, spirited away to be sold on a black market. Grocery stores in Europe and America report that cheese is among the most frequently stolen items in the building, so much so that some chains keep it tagged and locked. Think about that. There are people whose profession is stealing cheese by the ton. The peasant food nobody respected is now valuable enough to build a black market around. Then there is the strangest treasure of all, sitting in America. For decades, through the ups and downs of dairy price supports, the United States government has bought up and stored gigantic quantities of surplus cheese. At times, the national government cheese stockpile has swelled past 1 billion pounds, so much cheese that they ran out of room in warehouses and stored it in cold caves dug into the earth, including massive limestone caverns in Missouri. Picture it. Deep underground, in the dark, in the cool, a mountain of cheese so large it is measured in billions of pounds, owned by a government, aging in caves, because a whole nation produced more than it could eat and did not know what else to do with it. There are still enormous cheese reserves sitting in cold storage in this country right now, an underground hoard of dairy that most Americans have no idea exists beneath the ground they walk on. And at the far, ridiculous edge of the spectrum sits the world's rarest cheese, made in a nature reserve in Serbia from the milk of donkeys. Donkeys produce very little milk, and milking them is slow, brutal work, and it takes an almost absurd volume of that milk to make a single kilo of the pale, crumbly cheese called pule. The result is a cheese that sells for hundreds of dollars a pound, one of the most expensive foods on earth, made in tiny quantities by a handful of people from an animal almost nobody thinks to milk. And if you want to see just how far the obsession can go, travel to the island of Sardinia, where they make a cheese called casu marzu. It is a sheep's cheese that is deliberately left exposed so that a specific fly can lay its eggs in it. The eggs hatch. Living maggots swarm through the cheese, digesting the fats, softening it into a pungent cream. And then people eat it, maggots and all, some flicking the larvae off, some not bothering. It is technically illegal to sell, banned on health grounds, and yet Sardinians make it and treasure it and hand the tradition down, because to them it is not a novelty. It is theirs. It is heritage. That living, crawling cheese belongs to that island the way the blue caves belong to Roquefort, and no ban has ever managed to kill it. So think about all of that at once. A food born because our own bodies could not handle milk. A food buried with the dead in the deserts of China. A food that built a tower on a French cathedral because Europeans would not fast without it. A food a preacher hauled across a country in one 1,200-pound wheel to make a point about tyranny. A food that poisoned thousands of children when greedy men got their hands on it and painted meadows on the can. A food now kept in bank vaults, stolen by the truckload, hoarded in underground caves by a government, and left to crawl with maggots on an island that refuses to let it go. Now think of Mary in that Brooklyn room in 1858, holding a child killed by a lie about milk. She did not know any of this history. She only knew what she had been told, that the white liquid was pure, that it came from green fields, that it was safe. Everything she believed about that most ordinary of foods was a story someone sold her. And most of what you believe about the block in your own refrigerator is the same. A comfortable surface with 10,000 years of ingenuity, devotion, fraud, and death pressed silently inside it. You will never look at cheese the same way again. So before you go, I want you to tell me which one stuck with you the most, and be honest. Was it the bank in Italy with a vault full of cheese wheels worth over $100 million, stacked like gold bars? Was it the American government's secret mountain of cheese, more than 1 billion pounds of it, aging in cold caves under the earth right now? Or was it the island in Sardinia, where they let the maggots crawl through it and eat it alive? Drop a comment and tell me which one you had to read twice. And if this changed the way you see the most ordinary thing in your kitchen, subscribe, because next time we are taking another everyday object off your shelf and showing you the empire and the bodies hidden inside it.